Hello. The last part of our tutorial concerned cutting the clipping, the neckline, into the little dress that we're making. The next stage discusses something called bluff stitching, which is a retaining stitch that holds your seam away from the neckline and stops it rolling over towards the outside of the dress, which is not a good look. So I've got a scruffy piece of fabric here, black, with white thread, so obviously you'll be able to see what I'm getting at. And I'm just going to explain and show you exactly how to do bluff stitching. For the purposes of speed, I'm just using two pieces of black fabric that are a rough oblong, but you can bluff stitch on a curve, which I shall be explaining in a minute. And I'm taking a very quick foot space straight seam down this bit of fabric. So there's our seam. We're going to assume that the piece that I'm now pushing over is the facing. So this would be your dress, your cushion, whatever it is you want to bluff stitch. You push all the seams towards your facing, and you do have to make sure that they stay there. So you want to keep a hand under the cloth and just have a quick look every so often. You set the needle about 3 millimeters, which is about 1/8 of an inch, away from the seam that you have just done, and then you stitch through all those layers. Then when you fold it over so the white stitching goes to the back, it prevents that ugly rolling over that happens if you don't do it. So I'm now going to bluff stitch the neck of the dress. I've set the needle about 3 millimeters away from the seam that we've just done, and if you open out both bits of fabric, so on the left I've got the dress, on the right I have got the facing, make sure it's really flat and use these 3 fingers either side of that seam to pull it as flat as possible, and just ease your way round over the shoulder, which might feel slightly lumpy, but you can push the fabric under the foot very gently, and then into the front neck, still checking every so often with your thumb underneath that all your seams are going towards the facing. Back over the other other shoulder, I should say, round into the back neck, and finishing up at the other side of the centre back. Take your dress over to a table area so you can spread it out, as I have, with the facing uppermost. Then you want to make sure that this is all sitting flat, and it should do because you've bluff stitched it, which will help it stay down. You then line up the shoulder seam, put a pin through the seam itself, with the shoulder seam on the actual dress, and pin the two together. Keep it as flat as you can and pin right round the armhole, and the same down the centre back, not the centre back, down the back armhole and round into the side seam. Smooth it to the other side and do exactly the same thing. Check that your shoulder seams are together, and then pin back armhole together. And the same with the front. And then you're going to go back to the sewing machine and stitch a 1.5 centimetre or 5/8 of an inch seam allowance accurately all the way around both armholes. Trim it back to half that amount and clip all your curves, but I will go back through that with you as we do it. So back at the sewing machine, and you're going to set it with your calibration mark to the 1.5 line, and off we go. And just go slowly so that you can guide the machine accurately around your curves. Sometimes do say to my students, it's not a race, you know. You can go as slow as you like around these bits and you'll be much more accurate if you do. When you get to the shoulder, just check that the underneath seams are lying flat, and the same with the top, because it's a nuisance if you have to go back and unpick it and restitch it because one of them's flicked, which does happen. Now going down the back armhole, and you possibly can see that actually I tend to try to pull the curves slightly straighter. It just makes it easier to get the machine to stitch around them. Round to there, and that's the first armhole stitched. So you can repeat the same process for the second armhole, and I'll meet you back at the table to do the trimming and the clipping. As you did on the neck, trim the excess away right round the entire armhole. Over the shoulder. I'm not going any further at the moment because I'm now going to just repeat that you then clip the curves, and you need to clip about 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch apart through both the facing layer and the dress that's underneath, right back to within about 3 centimetres, which is 1.25 inches from your raw edge here. Continue to trim the rest of the back armhole and do exactly the same thing on the other armhole, and then I will show you how this all gets pulled through the shoulder section. Right, this is now what I call the magic bit. With the front of the dress to your right hand side, put your thumbs up the shoulder seam, and it can be a little bit tricky getting in there, and you are going to pull the back of the dress through the shoulder, and this is called bagging out. This is also why you leave the side seams and the centre back seam open for effectively all the stages to now. So you keep easing and tugging, and then eventually, well, not so eventually, you find that the rest of the dress will pull straight through that shoulder seam like that. And you do exactly the same on the other side. And then you're going to have to press everything flat before we put the side seams and the centre back seam together. I've spread the dress out so you can see what it's supposed to look like. I haven't yet taken it over to the ironing board, but already it's actually sitting down really quite well, particularly around the neck edge, which, if you remember, we've bluff stitched. So it helps control and pull everything to the underneath that you don't obviously want to show. If you find that on the sharp curve of the front armhole it might be slightly tight, disappear back inside and just check that you have clipped close enough to your stitching line. Don't clip the stitches, you'll make a hole and you'll have to sew over it. And I'm now going to take the dress over to the ironing board and press this properly. Then we've got a little bit of bluff stitching still to do on the facings of the armhole before we shut the side seams and the centre back. Back at the sewing machine, I've now set this up to partially bluff stitch the back armhole, which just happens to be the bit I've picked up. So you set it up exactly as you did for the neck. You're about 3 millimeters away from the seam that you've done. Check that all those seams underneath are going towards the facing. Now there's a limit as to how far round you can conveniently go, and I tend to stop when the curve becomes impossible to get into. So about there, and I will measure it so you get a rough idea of length. It's about 11 centimetres, which is plenty. That's the back armhole. Do exactly the same thing on the front, but the distance you can travel might be shorter, and I'll again measure it and tell you. You should by now have bluff stitched all your armholes, and we're now going to put the side seams together. The front dress is below, I've got the back dress uppermost. It doesn't really make a difference, I'm just explaining what I happen to have picked up. Put a pin through the seam part of where you have joined dress to facing and line it up with its opposite mark on the front dress. Now this is a commercial way of joining this. A dressmaker's pattern might very well tell you to have joined the seam allowance of the facing first. It's not wrong. Either way is perfectly acceptable. This we certainly find quicker, and if you needed to alter the frock at a later date, either to let it out slightly, or conversely if you needed to take it in for another child, making it this way makes the alteration much quicker. So you carry on pinning down your side seam, right through to the hem, and then you're going to sew this out with a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance, or 5/8 of an inch. So we're back at the side seam, which is pinned together. Line it up on the 1.5 centimetre, 5/8 of an inch line. Make sure that your facing seams are headed towards the facing. If they flick over, you'll have to unpick and reset them. And then it's straight down the side seam to the hem. I always give it a bit of a stretch as I go. It's not a real hefty stretch, it's just more, I suppose, of an ease. Check that your hem, the bottom of your dress, lines up. If they don't line up, then you need to investigate why. Don't just chop it off, because if you've cut it out accurately, your side seams should fit at the top and at the bottom. So that's the first side seam stitched. You can pin the next one and sew that, and then I'll meet you back at the sewing machine to show you how we do the centre back.